All right. Well, thanks for everybody. Thanks for joining us for the second installment of First Amendment rights and the values behind them. Last week, we heard from Tara Smith, UT professor of philosophy, on the First Amendment and what it means and why it matters. And this week, we're going to be hearing from Greg Salmieri, and he'll be speaking on the right to free speech and the value of speaking freely. I think most people who know who Greg is, I'll introduce him very quickly, and then we're going to hear from Tara a little bit, and then Greg will do his presentation. Greg's a longtime scholar of objectivism and Ayn Rand's philosophy. He is now the senior philosophy scholar and director of the program for objectivity and thought and action and enterprise at the Salem Center. He's written many articles on Ayn Rand's philosophy and other things. He's taught at a number of universities. I think probably my favorite thing that Greg has been involved in is he co-edited the Ayn Rand Companion, which is a kind of compendium of Ayn Rand's thought and many essays on her thinking. With that, let me then turn it over to Tara. I think you wanted to say a few initial words, and then we can go back to Greg and hear from Greg.
Yes. Now, my words, thank you, Steve. My words are really simply by way of an announcement that is relevant to all UT undergrads. So if anybody out there listening is a UT undergrad, I simply want to let you know about what should be appearing on your screen, the annual free speech essay contest here at UT, open to all undergrads, whatever school or program you're in. You can see there the prize money. We give prizes for the best, second best, and third best. Essays are due in early March. That gives you plenty of time to start thinking, maybe use the Christmas holiday. You can even, I think that's before spring break, but plenty of time. If you go to our website, the specific questions, there are two from which you get to choose. The specific questions are at the website, www.freespeechessay.com, but those are the general subjects. I really suggest you're giving it a whirl, okay? At any rate, thanks very much for being out there. Thanks, Steve and Greg, and I'm looking forward to the talk. And I will now again absent my face. Thanks.
Greg, before you go, let me just remind the audience something I should have said right off the top of the program, that if I encourage everybody to ask questions in the, I guess it's the Q&A, and or if you're watching on YouTube, you can post questions there and we'll be able to get them here, and I can put them to Greg and or Tara as appropriate. It's much better if we get audience questions. So please ask questions. And with that, Greg, take it away.
Okay, thanks. I'm just arranging my screen so I can see who we have here. Okay, good. So this is the session on First Amendment rights and the values behind them. That's the overarching program we have here. My paper is on the right to free speech and the value of speaking freely. So we'll start off by noting that the First Amendment recognizes, among other rights, a right to freedom of speech, which it says that Congress cannot abridge. The amendment as such is a check on the government, initially on the federal government, and then through the 14th Amendment Doctrine of Incorporation, a check on state and local governments as well. It's a check on their abridging the citizens' freedom of speech. So a non-governmental institution can't violate the amendment. But other institutions and people can, I think, violate the right that the amendment acknowledges. So for example, and here's a salient recent example, Samuel Paty is a teacher in France who was recently beheaded by people who objected to his showing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in class, right? And this is one of a number of violent acts meant to silence and intimidate people who blaspheme against Muhammad. If the government had a law like this preventing people, threatening them with force if they depicted Muhammad or Jesus or anyone else in a certain way, it would be a violation of the First Amendment. But I think it's clear here that it's not violating the amendment. The amendment doesn't say what terrorists can or can't do, but it is a violation of the right that the amendment is saying that the Congress won't abridge. And the point of the government, the purpose of the government in the American system, is to secure our rights, including this right, the right to freedom of speech, which I see as a aspect to our right to liberty. Government does or should protect us from violation of free speech, our right to free speech by others. That is, so the amendment is saying the government shouldn't itself violate this right, but it's acknowledging the existence of this right, and the right is something that people other than the government, in some cases, can violate. And I think that the principal clear-cut example is these beheadings of people who say express views of Islam or insult Islam, or express views in any case contrary to the beheaders or violent people's views. It's against such attacks on our rights that governments are meant to protect us. Their purpose is to secure our rights, including the right to free speech. This is why governments are instituted among men. Free speech is thus protected by protecting us from the kinds of things that people would do to shut us up, murdering us, imprisoning us, stealing from us, or threats thereof. And if you think about how does and should the French government be protecting people from this kind of behavior, how should the American government be protecting people from this kind of behavior, which includes not just beheadings, but things like heckler's vetoes, I think, if people are familiar with that concept, and any case where somebody forcibly tries to shut someone up. It's by protecting us against force. We already have laws against beheading. And I don't think that we need separate laws against ideologically motivated beheading. We have laws against theft. We have laws against intimidation. We have laws against harassment, etc. And it's through these very kinds of acts that we properly have laws against that people other than governments can infringe on one another's right to free speech by enforcing the laws that we have against these kinds of forcible interruptions of people and threats against people. A government can and should protect the right to free speech. And I think in some cases, the governments have not been aggressive enough in this. But there are, for example, if somebody, not aggressive enough in prosecuting cases where people are engaged in threatening behavior designed to intimidate people out of speaking. But there are many things that are not perpetrated by governments and not perpetrated by force in any of the ways that we've just talked to, that are often referred to or commented on or complained about as threats to or constraints on freedom of speech. I have in mind the many behaviors that are now often dubbed canceling, censorious attitudes on the parts of peers, employers, customers, etc., to people who won't toe some ideological line, speech codes on campuses or at businesses, content policies at social media companies, and the way these policies are enforced. Except where these things involve public schools or other such state-funded institutions, none of them violate the First Amendment. And moreover, I don't think they are violations of our right to free speech. That is, some things that aren't violations of the First Amendment can violate a right to free speech. But I don't think, for example, canceling somebody or firing them when they don't agree with you or having a speech code, even if I think that speech code is wrong or imprudent, is a violation of the right to free speech. But all of them do constrain or threaten or are in tension with an important value, which I'm going to call the value of speaking freely. So my main subjects today are the nature of this value. What is it to speak freely and why do we value it? The relation of this value to our right to free speech. And that's the second topic. And third, how we can pursue this value of speaking freely in a context where our right to free speech is protected. Because I think the protection of the right to free speech is a kind of sine qua non for the other things we can do to pursue this value. So let me start with some preliminaries about the distinction between the right and the value, and then we'll get into the nature of the value, some observations about it, and then these topics about the relation between the value and the right, and how we can go about trying to craft policies and our personal behavior so as to achieve this value in contexts where we are able to. So you often hear a lot about cancel culture as a new phenomenon. It's a new threat. It's not, in my view, so new, although it might be intensifying. Boycotts, blacklists, and canceling are not new. There have always been people who are unjustly discriminated against because of their ideas. And have always been people who whine that free speech is being violated when others don't want to support them in their promotion of ideas they disagree with. So these kinds of questions have always been around. If you're a Beatles fan like I am and have watched old documentaries about them, you'll recall that a bunch of Southern Christians and also, oddly, the Ku Klux Klan were involved in boycotts of the Beatles and burning of Beatle records after John Lennon made a comment about their being more popular than Jesus once. Staying with the popular music theme, you'll recall that in the early 2000s, a member of the Dixie Chicks, or maybe all of them, I guess they're now just the Chicks. Anyway, that music group made a comment about being embarrassed that the president then, George W. Bush, was from their same state of Texas, and a lot of people were enraged by that comment, and there was boycotting of their materials. And of course, there are people who make lists of professors who say what they regard as outlandish leftist things, and try to get people not to go to those schools or take their classes. All of that are examples of kind of boycotting, canceling, or attempts at that come from what might be seen as the right and has happened for a long time. And now we're seeing a lot of it, and people are particularly aware of it as coming from what's seen as the left over issues of social justice. If you have what's not a view that disagrees with them on racial justice issues, or, for example, people getting very upset at J.K. Rowling over her views on trans people, which is not consistent with the views of the people who are upset at her hold on the topic, putting aside who's right or wrong on it. So we have a lot of this coming from all different places, but there's always been some amount of this, sometimes more, sometimes less. And I don't regard, we ought to distinguish first a few different varieties of this kind of behavior. I'll call this canceling and related phenomena. There's non-support. Someone says or is selling a book or is giving a talk about something I don't agree with, and I don't like, and I don't want to support it. So I don't buy their book. I don't go to their talk. I don't hire them if I'm somebody who's or I don't rent them my hall to give a speech at. I don't want anything to do with this guy, right? There's no longer patronizing someone. I did work with Steve until he did this or said this, and now I won't anymore. I don't want anything more to do with the guy. That's kind of the same thing as not patronizing, except in a situation where I used to patronize, right? There's disrecommending, and I think blacklists also fall in this category. So not only am I not going to deal with you because I disagree with your views, but I'm going to go and tell people individually, Tara might be dealing with you, and I'll say, don't deal with him. He did this awful thing or whatever, or he holds this ridiculous view. Why would you want to be involved with a guy like that? And then there's boycotting or ostracizing, which is like large-scale disrecommending, right? It's a concerted attempt to convince others not to patronize or deal with someone. And I think canceling is, in effect, the now common term for boycotting or ostracizing. You're trying to get someone's television program canceled, or in general, get them fired, get them driven out of polite society, by making them seem toxic, by telling everyone how awful their ideas are, how awful this thing is that they did by driving away their advertisers. There are lots of cases of this. Roseanne Barr getting fired for making a racist remark about Valerie Jarrett, you might see as an example of that, or people who are recommending that you did that. And this is, again, not to say that this is bad. In at least some of these cases, I think it's the right thing to do. But it's just, there are these different categories of things. You're just simply not going to deal with somebody anymore. You're going to recommend to your friends not to deal with them, or you're actually going to go out and try to create a groundswell of fervor against them because you disagree with their ideas. I don't think any of this is a violation of the right to free speech or any other right. Not unless it's defamatory, which is a topic we could talk about later, and it's a specific legal topic. But the right to speech, as is often stated, is not the right to avoid all consequences for what you say, nor is it the obligation of those who disagree with you to provide you with a hearing, a platform, or any other sort of support. if people had such an obligation to continue dealing with you no matter what you say and under what circumstances you say it, what would become of their right to support the ideas that they believe in? What would become of their freedom of association? Nothing. They would in effect be your slaves, your servants, obliged to continue dealing with you on your terms no matter what you say, how horrible it is, and so forth. And of course, there were all kinds of cases of really fantastic things, or I think of as really fantastic things that were accomplished through boycotts. The Birmingham bus boycott in Alabama, prior to that, I think prior to it, but around the same time, early in the civil rights movement, there was a lot of gas stations would prohibit Black customers from using their restrooms, which white customers could use. And there was a campaign replete with bumper stickers and everything. Don't buy gas where you can't go to the bathroom. And a lot of people wouldn't go to those bathrooms, or wouldn't buy gas at those gas stations. And as a result, that policy was changed. Right? This is an example of boycotting. And I think there it was boycotting a commercial practice, but if the gas stations were spewing racist rhetoric and people boycotted them for that, I think it would be also good. So this is not then, as I understand it, a violation of the right to free speech. However, you are totally within your rights as a private individual, or in my view, as a company, if you will place conditions on who you'll hire, who you'll work with, etc. And even if you'll make us think about people who say certain wrong things and encourage other people to not deal with them. But again, there is a worry about doing too much of that in the wrong situations, what it could lead to. And so that's, again, what I want to think about and understanding what is this value of speaking freely. What I've given here in saying that these kinds of non-tolerant behaviors, you might call them, not tolerating people saying certain things, they're continuing to sanctioning them, continuing to work with them if they say things you regard as abhorrent, that is within your freedom and not a violation of freedom of speech, is what I think of as the traditional liberal position on the issue. It's, as I understand it, the position you find in Locke. It's the one that's defended currently by Rand and others, and Rand is sort of my inspiration in thinking about this. It's not, though, the only strand in the classical liberal tradition on thinking. And John Stuart Mill arguably views bringing social pressure to bear on someone, particularly if it's a lot of social pressure, the kind involved in ostracism and so forth, as equivalent to force, as a form of coercion. I think this is a mistake on Mill's part, but in talking about it, I think Mill, he brings our attention away from rights. Mill's not a thinker who thinks much about right, but I think he makes some valuable points about the value in different contexts of an environment in which a variety of views are available, in which a variety of views are being voiced. And so I think Mill on this is useful, even where I think he's wrong on or moving us in the wrong direction on the political issue of rights. There's a fantastic quote that's often used on the value of an environment in which people are able to, and able to here means free not just from coercion, but I think from other pressures as well, to express unpopular views. So I want to read portions of what's the famous quote, and this will kind of orient us towards the value of speaking freely. Mill writes, this is in On Liberty, "He who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them, but he is equally unable to refute the reasons of the opposite side. If he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion." Skipping a bit. "Nor is it enough that he should hear the arguments of adversaries from his own teachers, presented as they state them, and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. This is not the way to do justice to the arguments or bring them into real contact with his own mind. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them, who defend them in earnest, and do their utmost for them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. He must feel the whole force of the difficulty with which the true view of the subject has to encounter and dispose of, else he will never really possess himself the portion of truth which meets and removes that difficulty." And Mill goes on to note that very, very few people, even very few of what are called educated people, are really able to do this with their views because they haven't gone through the effort of really understanding the strongest case for the opposing views and reading the people who disagree with them. Mill's point, as I understand it, is that for one's convictions to be knowledge as opposed to mere opinions, one must have engaged with arguments against these convictions, offered in as strong a form as possible and as sincerely as possible. And generalizing from that point a bit, a context in which you've excluded from your consideration, a context in which you've excluded any view from consideration altogether is destructive to knowledge, even if the view is false and abhorrent. If you're not allowed to consider, or you're not allowing yourself, forget about the social side of it, to consider a certain view, however awful that view may seem to you, you're not allowed to think about what statements might there be for it, what might the arguments for it be. If the view turns out to be true, horrible to you though that would be, you're of course not putting yourself in a position to discover that. But worse, you're putting yourself in a position where you're not going to fully understand what's wrong with the view and what's right with the alternative view. To do it, you need to actually entertain it and think about it. And the social context is if you've created a situation where nobody who holds that view is able to voice it, or if they've written books about it, you can't get them or find them, you are harming yourself. And any society that does that is harming all the people in it who are doing the work to seek the truth. A further generalization, though, of this point. Real reasoning requires following the evidence wherever it leads. And so it's incompatible with dogmas. Real reasoning is incompatible with things that one cannot say or cannot question. If you're in a situation where you believe and you're functioning on the premise of, I must reach this conclusion, or I must not reach this other conclusion, come what may, what you're doing is not real thinking. Only free thinking is real thinking. And so if you're going to be doing any of your thinking in a social environment, you want the environment to allow for that free thinking. You need for the environment to allow for that free thinking. Moreover, all of the values we derive from other people depend ultimately on those other people's thinking. This is true at the very general level of living in society with people. It's because the other people think that the advantages of society are possible. If they were all unthinking, there'd be nothing to gain from living together in a society. And then it's true for every sort of association within that society or community, for business partnerships, commercial transactions, employer-employee relations, friendships, marriage, clubs, educational institutions. All of these things are valuable to us because there are other people in them, and the other people in them are able to think. But people are only really thinking and only really producing the values that they are able to produce by thinking, insofar as they're thinking freely, which means allowing themselves to go where the evidence takes them and not having certain things off limits for considerations. If people are thinking, they're not always going to agree on everything. It's in the nature of thinking. And people cannot work well or live well in environments or relationships that are contingent on their towing a narrow party line. That's why it's important to be able to speak freely, to think freely, and to express what you're coming up with. Not only that you're not going to be arrested or thrown in jail for it, but you feel able to, free to, and that you're not going to face over onerous consequences for expressing an idea that you're kind of thinking about. But that's the value of speaking freely. But I want to make two observations about this value that run counter to some of the defenses of what I'm going to call liberal speech policies. That is, policies that allow where it would be within the rights of the institution maybe to disallow certain types of speech. Say a social media platform might have the right to, and I think does have the right to, limit any kind of speech on its platform that it wants to. A more liberal policy would be a policy that allowed more open speech. And I want to make two observations about this value of speaking freely that might run counter to some of the defenses of liberal speech policies or free speech policies you've seen. First, I want to point out that the reasons I've given for valuing speaking freely and valuing context in which you can speak freely presupposes the importance of ideas. People are valuable to us. All their values to us come from their ability to function as human beings, which requires thinking, coming up with ideas. Those things are important. All the values, spiritual material we get from people comes from the different ideas they hold. And better ideas lead to more values and worse to fewer or to disvalues. Those ideas, the content of what people think matters. And it's because they matter so much, and because we need to explore to get the good ones, that we need a kind of society, and we need institutions within our society that are conducive to free thinking, to exploring and trying out different ideas. This is opposed to the idea that speech is just speech. Ideas are just ideas. They're not that important, and therefore we shouldn't make such a big deal about them. It's just saying, you're just saying something. Why should somebody get all up in arms about the fact that what you're saying is hateful to them in some way? Here I have in mind as a contrast to this, not so much a statement anybody made, but the terms of interaction in what came to be called the intellectual dark web. Many of the members of this web are people who I think do good work and admire, or at least on some issues do and others don't. But there's a little bit of a fetishizing of the fact that we all value free speech, so we could all be friends, even if we hold very different things. And the thing that's kind of emblematic of this to me is Dave Rubin, the talk show host, and Ben Shapiro, I guess also a talk show host, a political pundit, I guess you call him, talking to one another having kind of friendly conversation about their views on gay marriage. Dave Rubin is a married gay man. Ben Shapiro is someone who thinks gay marriage is wrong and shouldn't be legal, and who was saying in this conversation that he wouldn't come to a party that Dave had, an anniversary party celebrating his marriage. And they were it was a very genial conversation in a way that struck me as odd. I mean, there's something admirable about their ability to talk civilly and find what common cause exists despite these disagreements. But there's also, I think, something trivializing about their convictions if they're too friendly. You'd expect some recognition of their demeanors of the fact that one of them thinks that a relationship that's central to the other's life is wrong and should be illegal. Now, when you're on television and people are friendly, this isn't too deep a criticism of the people as individuals. Maybe they struck the wrong tone in that moment. But the mood that's put out by that, like the ideas don't really matter, our differences aren't important given our commonalities, I think is a mistake. It trivializes the ideas too much. I think part of why free speech is important is because ideas matter. They can be beneficial or disastrous in practice, good or evil. That's part of why we want an environment in which we can find the good ones. And what I mean by good is promoting human life and flourishing, and evil destructive of it. But there's another aspect to the good and evil of ideas. They come from good and evil places. To discover and really know an idea to be true requires that one practice certain virtues: rationality, following the evidence, independent thinking, integrity, the integrity that's involved in, for example, putting it into practice and seeing what happens, or considering counter arguments even when they might feel uncomfortable to you or whatever. So there's real virtue involved in getting at the truth. And vice is a real source of not getting at the truth: irrationality, running from the facts, not wanting to face things, faking to yourself. And what we want in our social environments, why we want an ability to speak freely, so to speak, is that we want a social environment that supports the exercise of those virtues. Rationality, including the seeking out of evidence on all sides and the really kind of exploring it. We want a social environment that supports that. We need a country that allows it by protecting our right to free speech, but we also want a work culture that supports it. We want relationships, friendships, romantic relationships that support each person's doing that. We want institutions that support it by encouraging debates that make it easy to access evidence. For example, libraries that carry books on a wide range of topics with a wide range of points of view in it. So the value of speaking freely comes about because ideas matter, because what you say matters, not because it's not that important. And the second observation that runs counter to, or might seem to run counter to, valuing speaking freely, it certainly creates a context in which you have to think about what it really means to pursue this value, is that any cooperation, any venture people are involved in together, presupposes some agreement at least about the goals and premises of the venture, and about the suitability of the other people involved for that. For example, a belief in evolution by natural selection is presupposed by lots of scientific research. And so you can't join a team conducting this research and believe evolution's false. It would be destructive to that team. Now, if you have a society in which people can't debate whether evolution is true or false, that would be a problem and would prevent people from ever really knowing that it's true. But in a context where you have a wider society where that debate is possible and going on, you also need to conduct detailed research, be able to get the people who have concluded it's true together to say, here's a venture just for those of us who believe evolution is true, who know it's true, but for the sake of argument, just to believe it's true. And we believe these other things about it, and that's motivating this research project. Likewise, for a company, there are certain views that are inherent in each company, what their kind of mission is, what their project is. There might also be premises that are presupposed in joint ventures about the terms of interaction among the people. This includes, for example, some mutual respect is involved in working with people. If someone believes, for example, that only white Christian men are fully human and that only such people are able to reason aright, that belief may be incompatible with his working with diverse team members on a common project, or with his teaching students who include people who aren't white or Christian or male. So some institutions, employers, educational institutions, etc., may want to rule out, may need to rule out expressions of what they regard as things that are run contrary to the basic principles on which they're gathered together. And that might include things that they regard as expressions of disrespect for that would undermine the community that they're trying to build. There's also the issue of agreement about who has authority over what. If we're going to work together on a project, I need to know who owns which parts of it, who's the boss and who's subordinate to him, particularly if it's a complex structured whole with different people reporting to one another. There might be agreement that has to be presupposed about that for us to work together. And although it might be true that it's fine to question that in some contexts, maybe work isn't the time for some of those questions, or certain times at work aren't. So the value, speaking freely is a value. That is, environments that promote, encourage people to dissent, to voice different opinions, to go say whatever they think, even if it cuts against the grain there, right, are valuable. But we have to keep in mind that any kind of social group, a business, an organization, an institution, a school, is going to presuppose some agreement. And there's going to have to be limits into how much people can disagree with the things that bring them together and still be part of that community, part of that organization. And here I think it's really important to note the importance of freedom of association and how it relates to the right to free speech. You have to judge which cooperative endeavors to join and on which terms, given the fact that each cooperative endeavor is going to have certain limits on, going to place certain limits on what you can do and say within your interaction with it. And if you disagree with those principles, or you disagree with their way of implementing them, then you don't want to be part of that organization. I think it's a really important right to associate or not associate with different people, to choose your associations, knowing that each association is going to presuppose certain agreements and going to, then that's going to have implications for how you can conduct yourself within the context of that association. So what's the relation of all of this back to the right to free speech? Well, as I see it, a society is the minimal form of association. Some of us in the United States of America are members of the same family, or work at the same university, or the same advocacy group or business. Some of us are friends with one another. Some of us go to the same church, belong to the same volleyball club, whatever it is. But we aren't all members of any of these same things. The society is this wider whole in which we're available to one another as people who can interact with each other, but also as people who can choose not to interact. It's a kind of underlying context where we're all living in the same place, under the same laws, and able to interact or not as we see fit. And rights are, as I understand them, the basic principles that we need to coexist in a society, as opposed to in any of these more maximal, complex forms of interaction that are within a society. Rights are, as I understand them, the basic principles that we need to coexist in society, and therefore the basic principles that should structure society. They are principles that delineate the spheres in which each person's reason reigns. They're principles that delimit what is up to whom in cases of disagreement. And here I'm drawing on Ayn Rand's identification of rights as moral principles defining an individual's freedom of action in a social context. The state then is the institution that protects and preserves rights, and the rights are the principles by which states are judged and the principles governing the operation of a proper state. So rights, the right to free speech, the right to associate, our other liberty rights, our right to life, are all the background context in which we have to make choices about how and on what terms to deal with one another. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind in choosing to deal with one another is that all the values we have to gain from dealing with one another have to do with one another's thinking, and that we're only thinking if we're thinking freely, if we're allowing our thought to go wherever the evidence takes us, and that will lead to disagreement sometimes. And so we need to value disagreement as well as agreement to not create a censorious environment in which a party line has to be towed, but rather value the expression of differences and so forth, insofar as is consistent with the kinds of agreements that are presupposed by the kinds of relationships we have. And so what I want to talk about now is the challenge of crafting good relationships, institutions, and policies in a context where you're free to do so. So first of all, I think it matters that not all organizations and not all relationships should have the same policies. I already alluded to this in the case of discussing evolution. It certainly shouldn't be illegal to deny evolution, but there also ought to be organizations in a free country that are forums for debate and discussion about whether evolution is true or false. There should be societies at which things are debated. There should be libraries that carry books covering a wide range of views, and people can go in and check out either kind of book. And this is for the kinds of reasons that Mill was eloquent at pointing out, that in order to really know what's true, an individual needs to be able to get access to all the different views supported by the people who support them. And for this reason, not just whether evolution is true or false, but views that are even more stigmatized and I think rightly stigmatized, like Holocaust denial ought to be legal. And not only ought it be legal to deny the Holocaust, as it's not in much of Europe, but there ought to be forums, organizations, libraries, and so forth that make it a point to include in their collections works holding the stigmatized view, as well as works holding the consensus agreed upon view. Because it's only by looking at these that you can really understand how wrong and bad they are and what's wrong and bad about them and what mistakes they're making. So I think it's an important thing in a society that there be some maximally open forums, some places where it's part of their policy that even if we think your ideas are evil, vicious, and destructive, we want them here too. We want all ideas here. I think it's important that there be such forums. I also think it's important, though, that we treat them in a solemn way, not as this is kumbaya. I get together with the Holocaust deniers and people who hold every view abhorrent to me, and we pat each other on the back over how tolerant we are and how wonderful this is. That I think undermines the value of such a forum. I think such forums should be viewed as forums where ideas by people who are really deeply opposed to each other are discussed, and where the people who are discussing them don't share anything in common necessarily, other than the very narrow thing of valuing that there's a forum where this kind of exchange could occur. So maybe very minimal collegiality or something, or not even that. But the value is undermined when it's not treated as, when people too much congratulate themselves on it, it's not treated as solemn. Institutions, though, of different sorts. So that's one type of institution, the maximally open forum. But I think other institutions are not going to be like that. They shouldn't be like that, not every institution. And what I think there's a need for is for every institution, business, etc., to be as clear as it can be about the sort of agreement that is presupposed by affiliation with it of different sorts. And then to allow and encourage the full diversity of speech and opinion that's compatible with that agreement. So the point isn't that we should have open policies where anyone can say anything anywhere and I can go to whatever business and say, this is what your policy should be. But I do think there's something to say at the meta level, which is that if you own a business, if you run a library, if you run an event hall, you should be thinking about what is my mission here and what kind of agreements are presupposed by it, such that if somebody doesn't share this agreement, this principle, they're no part of this project. And once one's delineated that, one should say, okay, well, here's therefore the things that can't be said here, the things that can't be discussed because we all assume we agree with them, but we're clear about that going in. And these are the things that, within that context, other things are open to discussion. And I think it can be really hard to do that. I'm not saying this is easy. I think it's going to have to be, for any organization doing it, it's going to have to evolve as our understandings of these things evolve. And I think likewise in personal relationships, these things evolve. But I think one has to be clear on the fact that there are some things that you're not going to tolerate. And you're not going to tolerate them because they're incompatible with your understanding of the relationship that you're in and your reason for having this relationship. I think this is a really difficult issue for social media companies. I think people think it's easier than it is. They think it's obvious they should be banning certain things or not banning certain sorts of speech. And I think this trivializes the challenge that these companies are facing. They're trying to build a new kind of community. And they have a lot of decisions to make about what kind of community precisely they are trying to build. And different ones may make different choices. And that'll determine what kind of communities they are. But what I think we can hope for and ask for from these communities, and what we could, if we're involved in building them, try to think about is, well, what is it that what is the value that we're trying to create with this community? What does that presuppose in terms of how people are interacting with them, and therefore what agreements are kind of presupposed in it? And therefore, what are our policies going to be here? And the more explicit we can be on that, the better. Universities. Universities, because they are venues that are about imparting knowledge, I think the Mill quote that I read earlier is particularly germane to them, right? Universities are about teaching people things. They're about being places where people can learn. And so I think it's especially important to allow as much debate as possible, as many stigmatized, marginalized, etc., ideas as is possible there. And is compatible with whatever minimum level of, well, first of all, safety certainly, and also mutual respect is compatible with the university's aim. And it's going to differ for different kinds of universities because they have different missions. But you get a lot of challenges now that certain speech or viewpoints disrespects, belittles, erases certain people. And so there's a logic to the idea that opinions thought to be prejudiced against races, genders, sexual orientations, etc., need to be, are incompatible with having the university, with having this community. But I think here what's important is to distinguish putative mistakes, which though still harmful, are compatible with the respect required to work together to advance the common goal of the organization, that is knowledge and teaching, from views that undermine that basic level of respect. And I think it's hard to work out where that line is, and the burden of doing it falls on everyone, but I think we ought to recognize that that's a challenge we share in working together. Okay. Another point relative to this, it especially comes up in the context of universities, but I think is relevant to a lot of groups. It's difficult, as I say, to see where these kinds of lines fall. The burden of doing it falls on everyone, but it's very often shouldered especially by people who are in some type of minority or other within the community. And that's true of intellectual minorities, people who hold views that are, are out of favor. It's also held by racial minorities, any kind of group that somehow has a different perspective, is likely to face different challenges, etc., is going to have to do more work towards this than others, because their view isn't going to be held in common. So I think it's important to recognize the nature of the difficulty here, including one's reasons for association, the needs of the mind, the problems of people feeling disrespected and so forth. It's need to just recognize that problem. And then I think in a context where we're going to allow for the maximal amount of expression within the larger university community, if it's a university, I think the same goes for business. I think it's important to also support the existence of groups that are for those who are or believe themselves to be marginalized, whether for ideological or other reasons. They can be an adjunct to the coexisting in an ideologically diverse organization or racially diverse organization or any other kind of diverse organization. They can do that if they make their goal helping people to navigate this more diverse community, rather than making their goal the enforcing of some ideology or the enforcing of the interests on the whole, what they perceive to be the interests of the group that makes them up. One last topic, and then we'll go to conversation. All of these things are made immensely more challenging in the context of public or governmental institutions. I don't think there ought to be many such institutions. Certainly, I don't think universities, libraries, debating societies other than legislatures, which aren't just debating societies, ought to be governmentally run. Government is what we all do together, brooking no dissent by force. And its involvement in anything other than rights protection violates rights for that very reason. There's no way, as I see it, to run a public school or a public park that doesn't violate First Amendment rights. Any way of doing it will involve coercing support for ideas which one may disagree and with which one may disagree without violating rights. Given that such institutions do exist, though, and that we're all living our lives in the context of them, what policies should they exist? I think here it's got to be the same policies that a private institution with the same purpose would enact, but with an extra emphasis on being as inclusive of different opinions as is possible given their purpose. And this demands a level of clarity of purpose in advance of what's even demanded by a private institution. Because in a private institution, if I disagree with how Steve's supper club handles itself with regard to speech policies, and the problem isn't just what the policies are, but I think that they're vague or not well enough defined, or Facebook's content policies like this, I can get out of supporting Facebook. I can disassociate from Facebook. I can delete my account, not go on it, etc. But when it's the government doing it, I can't. I don't have the freedom from disassociation from the government. I'm part of this society, and the government is what runs this society and what governs this society, whether I like it or not. My tax money supports it, and even if taxes were voluntary, I'm under its rules. And so I think that there's for that reason, I think government should do as few things as possible, nothing other than the protection of rights. But if it's going to run a school or going to run a park where people can come and speak or protest or whatever, it has to really place a premium on this is what can be said there and this is what can't, and here's why. And anything that can't be said there has to be a clear and direct justification for that's directly tied to the purpose of the things existing. So like, for example, you can't have a march and block a street because the whole reason the street is here for, this street is here for, is to let people get to the hospital or whatever, and the march prevents that. And you could debate about whether we should have a street for that purpose or not, but if we're going to have one, the purpose is incompatible with letting it be a soapbox for people. Okay, so there's the basic content I wanted to get across. Let me just summarize the main points. The right to free speech is distinct from the value of speaking freely. The value of speaking freely is the value of, in a community, in a group, that you have the ability to speak what's on your mind without too much heed to consequences, without being worried and second guessing yourself about what you might say that you might encounter negative social consequences. It's the encouraging of free conversation, open, ready exchange. That is not something you have a right to. You have a right to find and create environments like that through your voluntary interactions. You should be trying to find that in your environments, because that kind of freedom of thought and freedom of expression is a part of what enables us to think well. And thinking is the source of all the values we get from one another. But you can't have a situation where every cooperative endeavor allows everyone to say whatever's on his mind at any point, no matter what, with no no consequences from anyone, because the whole purpose and nature of cooperative ventures presupposes some disagreement, and some things you might say are fly in the face of that disagreement, and therefore is incompatible with the organization. And so we need the right to form voluntarily and disassociate or associate with people in search of kind of environment where we can do the kind of thinking and speaking and communicating we want. And when we have that right, we should be looking to craft our social relationships and our institutions so as to allow the maximally liberal exchange of ideas that's consistent with the policy of those, with the purpose of those organizations. Okay, that's that. Let's open up for discussion.
Thanks, Greg. So there are two questions in the Q&A which are related, and I figure it makes sense to start with them because they get to one of the points that you made, and probably a good way of jumping into a discussion about, you know, how what you've talked about applies in concrete context. So let me ask both these questions. These are from Donald Baldwin. I'm going to edit slightly the first one, and I'll ask the second one after, but I think I'll get the gist of it. So here's the first one. While you don't consider canceling conservative speakers at public universities as a violation of free speech, would you agree that this is totally inconsistent with learning that is supposed to be a feature of higher education? And I think the second one is related, which is, do you subscribe to the University of Chicago's principles on speech codes as the most advanced in freedom concepts that have been published? You're probably familiar with the university.
Yeah. So on the first count, absolutely. I think almost all of the events of trying to get speakers disinvited from campus and so forth that I have seen on public campuses or private campuses, I think are wrong, bad, contrary to the purpose of the university, and just not good, and something to really be opposed, particularly if you're a university president or administrator. Maybe there's some case, you know, somewhere that's not like that. But most of the ones that have met the news have been like that. Some have actually been violations of the right to free speech. There was a case with Charles Murray, someone who I don't admire at all, and think is kind of in a lot of ways a pernicious intellectual influence. But in any case, I think, you know, someone who people should learn, listen to, and learn if I'm right about him or not. But not only was there an attempt to get him disinvited from a campus, there was, you know, fisticuffs, and somebody was injured who was a co-panelist with him by a group of students. And there are case after case of, I think, heckler's veto, where people get up and stand and shout speakers down, is a violation of the right to free speech. I think it's basically threats and harassment, and I think the people who do that should be arrested. So there are cases of actual violations of the right to free speech in these university cases, even at private universities. But there are, in addition to that, even where it's not violations of the right to free speech, the attempts to shut down discussion on campuses, even through peaceable means, I think are really deleterious to the purpose of a campus, to the purpose of a university. And where they're public universities, I think there are additional First Amendment concerns.
Can I just add a little bit to that? And I should say, I was bumped off for some reason toward the end, so I missed 5 or 6 minutes. It took me a while to get back on. So you were talking a little bit about this as I got bumped off. But so 2 things about universities or higher ed. One, and I think that you at least said a little bit about this, Greg, different universities or colleges have somewhat different purposes. There are technical schools. You can go there and learn how to be an airplane pilot or something like that. There are religious institutions which have varying degrees of how much they want religion to influence their curriculum. But I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that not all colleges or universities have the same mission. That said, those universities or colleges that put themselves forth as about the transmission of knowledge and discovery of new knowledge and pushing frontiers, yes, I completely agree with what Greg and I think the questioner was saying, in that it's particularly galling for freedom, vigorous exchange of even some really wild ideas. It's particularly galling for that not to be permitted in the place that's supposed to be dedicated to figuring out what's wrong. And I mean, just one example, back in the early 20th century, the best schools, the Ivies and the other really most respected schools, all had confirmed eugenicists on their faculty. This is what the respectable people thought. Turns out they were wrong. The only way you find out who's right and who's wrong is to continue to have the kind of vigorous liberal discussion that Greg was talking about, that John Stuart Mill was talking about.
And another just example of that, I mean, a lot of the, go back to abolitionism, which was a really radical position in the 1900s, or sorry, the 1800s, particularly the earlier parts of the 1800s. Abolitionists' right to free speech, they were attacked all the time, right? It was dangerous to voice so their rights to free speech are being attacked. The government's job was to protect them, but not only did the government not protect them, right? It worsened the problem because a institution, the post office, that was run by the government, right, in many places would not distribute abolitionist pamphlets. And there were court, I believe, cases on this. There definitely were court cases later on the post office shutting down mail about contraception, right? So if it was a private company, you know, whatever, you know, racist anti-sex courier that set up business, and they would bring mail to anyone so long as it didn't advocate, you know, abolition or birth control, right? That would be within their rights to do it, and it wouldn't be a violation of freedom of speech, but it would be a damn stupid policy for a courier service to have. And it's a case in which I would encourage people to boycott that courier service, right? To cancel them, so to speak. And that would be an application of the right to free speech. But when the government does it, you can't boycott or cancel them. You can't say, don't buy gas where you can't go to the bathroom, because this is the only place you're able to buy gas. You're allowed to buy gas. And you can't say, try to come up with and get investors together to start a contrary company to sell gas and let you use the bathroom. So I think it's really important that we keep the right distinguished from the value, so that we can figure out how to promote the value and understand what's preventing us from achieving it in a lot of situations where we are. And I think the post office example is a good one for that. And the reason why I bring it up is because it's a case like the eugenicist case that Tara gave, where something that we now all accept is true, or almost all accept is true, and something that's now conventional wisdom, both in these cases kind of left-leaning conventional wisdom, but held by almost everyone, just more associated with the left, was once a verboten opinion. And it took people really fighting against the grain to change that.
Yeah.
Thanks. Let me follow up on that though. So Tara made the point there are different institutions and they have different missions, but you can also there's the same, one could say the same thing about an individual liberal arts university. In other words, they have a teaching purpose, right? And then they have sort of, I don't know, think of it as extracurricular activities and just general, like you think of it as it's a broad community where the exchange of ideas is important. And let me give you a concrete example, and I'd like you to just think through this and tell me what you think about this. So there's a distinction that one can draw between, let's say, I'm pro, I believe in evolution, right? So I'm using this example on purpose, but inviting somebody who is a proponent of intelligent design, which basically denies evolution, to come give a talk to students because, I don't know, some group on campus wants to just hear from this person. And then you might say, well, we don't want to cancel that guy. Everybody should have, even if we disagree and we think it's contrary to what the university is teaching. There's a difference between that and then saying, let's have this guy teach a class in biology where he presents the alternative view to the evolution perspective. And is there not a distinction that we would need, that a university should draw between those two things and others like them, Greg? So, and Tara, obviously, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that's just the distinction. There's a level of endorsement implied in the hiring somebody as a faculty member. The biology department at this university thinks this guy knows his stuff about biology and has a view that is serious and in contention and worth hearing and so forth, and worth hearing not just as a kind of curiosity to debunk, but as a serious contender for what views reasonable people think might be true, right? And reasonable, well-informed people think might be true and are worth elevating and giving a special platform to. I think it's important that somewhere in the society, there be a place where the crackpot can express his views. And I think the reason to have the crackpot at the university, that is in the capacities where he can be allowed, or the people that the faculty regard as the crackpot, people who include me for a lot of universities on a lot of topics, I should say, right, is out of respect for the students. So you're respecting, you are inviting the students here to learn, to pay you to learn from this faculty. And part of what you expect the students to do is on their own time, that is outside of class, think about the different views they're hearing, think about alternatives to it, get together, discuss them, weigh the pros and cons. It's part of their processing of the class material to hear and think about kinds of things that they may think are being excluded from the class. And if the university tried to bring in or pick everyone that they thought was like that, one, it would be impossible, and because there'd be too many people, and two, it wouldn't actually advance that value. The value is that the students on their own time think through the objections and other things and so forth. And the university facilitates their ability to do that by allowing for student groups and giving student groups access on certain terms to university property and so forth, and having making it easy for students to get together and invite people to come in and give them heterodox opinions. And that, I think, is an important part of how universities work, and they ought to work that way. Now, at least consistent with the missions of most universities. And that's how I'd like to see it happen. That's how I think it is happening most of places, most of the time, although there's more shutting down now maybe than there have been at some other periods.
What would be the limits? Sorry, Tara, if you want to go
I
ahead.
was just going to add a tiny bit on that, which is just to say that, universities, they have a job to do, whatever the mission of a particular university, a liberal arts college, or, however it sees its job, then it's got to be making decisions constantly. Again, not just about what faculty to hire, what courses to offer, what courses to require for you to get a chemistry major at this school or a history major at this school. So, part of a university's role is to be discriminating among, would-be claims to truth, which are the more credible. So they have to go to a large extent by the state of knowledge in the given fields, anthropology, philosophy, history, whatever, and they have to be making those judgments. Now, I think it's perfectly fine for them to still leave on the library shelves certain discredited views, certain historically views that we've transcended and so on, right? So in that sense, the university can be, and I think should be, making available a lot of alternative views. But I agree definitely with what Greg was saying about it. Doesn't mean you have to hire the creationist to teach the stuff, nor does it mean you should discourage, if there's enough students through the usual means of students pursuing these interests on campus, even there's enough interest among students, and we want to hear from this guy. We think there might be something worthwhile in what he has to say. Yeah, allowing that. Again, to kind of follow up on what you hope you're stimulating, the genuine thought and engagement in the classrooms.
And I would go even further than that. I would say a university ought to make it its business to have on its library shelves, whenever they can, as a much wider range of material than actually taught in the courses. And if they can do so without sacrifice, they also ought to accept donations, and for most universities, even most missions, of whatever kind of books, are donated to them. So if some horrible Nazi or something wants to donate my library of, Nazi propaganda to a library, I think a university library in general should accept the donation on the premise of it's here, the students can look at it, and our professors will say what's wrong with it. but they shouldn't do it if it's becoming a sacrifice such that the library would become, you could imagine someone taking advantage of that. We're going to use up all your budget having to build shelves to hold our paraphernalia or whatever, and therefore you can't do it. But insofar as they can, put it in their collection and make it available when people come and ask for it and it's not a sacrifice, I think they should be willing to, on the premise of it's no endorsement to have the thing here. And our view is this is an artifact in the culture. We're trying to make whatever artifacts people want to know about available to who wants to know about them.
Are there limits? But this is for either, but let me start with you, Greg. Let's get back to the speaker example, inviting speakers to campus. What would you say are the limits to, even what a university just should not be willing to invite certain speakers, or maybe you don't think there are any, but I'm curious, and kind of flesh out what you think the principles are there.
So here, I think it's again going to depend on the purpose of the university, but I think that certainly if the person is going to threaten, intimidate, things that would legally be threats or intimidation or whatever against members of the campus community, or really anyone, because those things are illegal, those certainly should not be permitted. But then those things are illegal to begin with. I think there's also sort of basic rules of decorum for a community about who's members of the community and what counts as kind of serious and sustained disrespect to members of the community, such that to say these things is to not regard them with the minimum level of respect necessary to tolerate their presence. And I think necessary to regard them as actual audience of what you're saying. So, and I think that is a standard that I think universities and organizations in general should be using. But I think it tends to be put at too high a bar. So I think if somebody came in and gave a speech that was a bunch of racist slurs, I think that would cross what I think would be a reasonable line to have. You can't have this person, or even included them in the speech, not as objects of discussion. Here's this word used in Huck Finn, and here's why it, what its function is there, or here's this word used by a bigot, and here's why it's offensive. But, someone who's actually using it in his own voice. But, if something is, there's a level of insult to the student body that I think each institution has to judge what is the level of that's tolerable. But I think they should be trying to set as much inbounds as possible than as much out of bounds. And if we think about actual cases of this, where this has been, an issue, one that comes to mind is Milo Yiannopoulos, when he was going around, this was a few years ago, giving talks on campus. And there he was, I don't know exactly what he was saying in some of these cases, but he was making divisive remarks about trans people. And some of what was said was that he might actually be endangering them by, for example, exposing people, particular people on the screen as, here's a person at your school who's trans, isn't this person awful, and subjecting them to mockery and ridicule, and maybe in some cases exposing them to violence by making them a target of the crowd. But I'm sure there are cases of that don't rise to the level of incitement to violence, but that are nonetheless inconsistent with a basic level of respect for members of this community. That is, you can't have an event that's about making a mockery of one of our students at our school. Part of what they're signing up for is them being treated, with a basic modicum of respect. And so if he was doing that kind of thing, as was claimed, again, I didn't see this, I think, there's a case for not having that, but not a case for him not having, saying views about the nature of transness, or what should be, what public policy should be with respect to it. I think that at a public university, I think would need to be allowed.
It just seems like there's a difference. It's a hard call to figure out when you're on one. There are cases in which it's a hard call to figure out, are you on this or that side of the difference? But there's a difference between a speaker and the group sponsoring the speaker wanting to have this speaker so that it can insult or provoke or ridicule or just make a scene or get on the news or something like that. And serious effort at intellectual disagreements. Like, no, this is a minority view, this is a strange view, but here's why we think it's right. If that's the sort of thing that it seems that the sponsors and the speaker are going to deliver, that's part of the whole intellectual mission, or again, environment surrounding the school itself and its mission.
It'd be important that some kind of standards be promulgated in advance. So for example, no talk can single out members of this campus community for ridicule, and or some more general principle that would include that. That's a kind of principle, it seems to me, campuses ought to have. And maybe, one won't know one of those principles until a case occurs, and maybe Milo says something, but then we should make it a rule, and then we're not going to have someone who exposes the leader of the Federalist Society to undue ridicule or something for some, whatever.
All right, let me go to a audience question. This is from Anonymous. Question is, to what extent should universities take a formal stand on social issues, particularly public institutions, especially in light of the reality that popular opinion on such issues changes over time? In particular, to what extent should such a stand influence their policies on the beliefs that faculty, students, visitors, et cetera, should hold?
Well, I think they often have to take stands in making decisions on issues other than what's taught. So this is university, private or public. You're going to have dormitories at the university. Are they co-ed or single? What if somebody has sex in a dorm room? Are they going to be expelled, or is that okay? And your views on premarital sex or gay sex or whatever, you're going to have to take some stands on some issues. Or do you is modesty an important value, and therefore everybody has to be covered up all the time, or not? So you're going to have to take some stances on some things that are social issues, just in the course of running an institution that involves a lot of people interacting with one another. I think one should try to separate and make clear wherever possible the position that you're taking as a matter of governance of the university from any ideological issues there might be, debates about the premises behind that position. There's a limit to which you can do that. But for example, I think you should be able to have somebody arguing that more modest dress leads to a better society on a college campus that doesn't have dress codes that enforce modesty. And I think it would make for a better university, private or public, if it allowed ideas that allowed discussion of ideas that run counter to some of its policies whenever that's possible. In the case of a public university, I think it has to. I think ultimately there are contradictions involved in being a public university, and there's no way to do it perfectly. But you should try to take as minimal a stance as possible on as few of these issues as possible, as is compatible with running the thing at all.
This is, I think, a good follow-up question. This is from Shoshana Milgram-Knapp. Can't we condemn Google and Twitter morally for preventing free expression on their platforms, even though they should not be deemed culpable legally?
You could, if you thought what they were doing, on certain views of what they might be doing, it would be appropriate to do that. But I don't think what they're actually doing is morally bad, except insofar as they're not being as clear as they could be about what they're doing. But as I view it, they are trying to solve, for the first time in history, a really, really intractable problem at scale. if they just let anything be posted at, there are going to be ISIS recruitment videos and kiddie porn and things right on the, and so forth. And there were these kind of things, and they had to get services to bring them down. And then what about just regular old pornography? And some of these services, part of the idea is that children should be able to be on them, and so parents wouldn't let their children be on FD. So there's questions about what kind of community are they trying to build? And are they, do they want to be vectors for disinformation campaigns, or do they not? And what would make them a vector for that? And then it's not as though these services were these entirely neutral platform. Like they were, Twitter was closer to this, but it's not like they were like literal bulletin boards that were out there, and whatever somebody posted, the next person comes and sees the last thing that was posted, and that's what they've always seen. These things have always been YouTube, Facebook, etc., run by algorithms that use some kind of criteria to feed you the next thing you're going to see, that it's going to think as, you'll most want to see next, or whatever kind of reason. That have to do with what their business model is and what kind of service they're trying to build. And those algorithms have always prized some kind of content over other kinds of content. And they've always been tinkering with those algorithms to try to figure out what they want them to do. And sometimes they find, like, the way the algorithms are set now, unexpectedly are propagating stories that get people outraged over political causes. And we didn't expect that was what's going to happen, but it is what's happening. So now we want to change the algorithm to suppress those and bring up other kinds of stories. It's really hard to do it well. It's hard to figure out what they're trying to do. I think these are the kind of people I'm talking to when I say you should try to make what your goals here are as explicit as possible. But it's really, really hard. And they're trying to do it for the first time. No one else has built something like this that works better. And so I think there's a lot of compassion that's due to these companies that have brought us a tremendous service, have run into the face of tremendous problems in trying to run them, and there are hardly any sources of good advice in how to deal with them. And everybody thinks they know how to run Facebook better than Mark Zuckerberg. BS, you don't know how to run it better than Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe you have some good ideas he should consider, but the guy's done really well, and it's hard to do it better. And I'm sure they've done some particular things that I think were bad calls, and different ones did different things, but it's really, really hard. And
can I add a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead, Tara.
Yeah, no, I agree. 4 years ago, that election, they took a lot of heat because because of what they allowed. Now they start trying to disallow certain things, and they take a lot of heat for what they're disallowing. I'm not going to give them an open ticket ad infinitum to figure this out, but I completely agree with what Greg is saying. What they're trying to do is bloody damned hard. And again, the community that they're serving is the whole goddamn universe. It's like everybody all over the globe. It's not just people in this country or in this hemisphere or something. So they're trying to serve an awful lot of people. And yeah, they've always had to have selectivity. It's not a literal black bulletin board or something like that. So we've got to be working. I mean, they've got to be working on this, and there will be competitors that will say, we will not censor along these, or we will not restrict along these lines or those lines. But we've all got to give, I think, a lot more thought to what are the kinds of media that we think are worth our looking at, listening to, watching, and so on, right? So I also agree with, the way you put it toward the end of, we don't know what the policy should. I mean, it's hard to figure out. Again, that doesn't mean I'm never going to criticize them for policies, but depending on the particular example that one focuses on, one can make a given action where they allowed something or disallowed something seem much more outrageous or egregious and so on. But they're trying to come up with, again, policies, principles that will govern. So yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not yet ready to say, oh, they should just allow it all. No, I don't want them to allow it all any more than I want, a much more edited newspaper that I read in the morning or magazine. I don't want what anybody thinks. Now, I mean, there are differences there, but there are good reasons to want a certain kind of curation. I think you get more valuable stuff when you get certain kinds of curation, and you can mix up the media of different sorts that you expose yourself to, so that you can get even different filtering mechanisms, so that you're feeding yourself the variety, so that you can engage in that sort of, well, what do these people have to say.
And the idea that Facebook is some, or Twitter, or some kind of hard leftist enclave that's censoring right-wing media comes only from people who don't know real leftists. If you know real, because that's where I hear this most, if you know real leftists, like people who are actually, you know, want to defund the police and they think that America is an imperialist, racist state, they're horrified that Facebook's taking their stuff down. And I mean, because I have a couple of people I went through graduate school with who are of that kind of point of view, and they're in my Facebook feed too, and they're complaining, and they sound just like the right-wing people who are complaining about it. Facebook's trying to craft policies to elevate and de-elevate, to de-elevate views that they worry are foreign propaganda, or are not what they claim they are. Like the group Blacktivists was one of the leftist things that was like this, and allegedly it's Russian trolls. I don't know if it is. But they're trying to do that. And of course, they're going to have their own biases, which is like the bias of center-left technocrats, basically. You know, so they're going to tend to err in the direction they're going to tend to err in on it. But if you think from the perspective of the company, right, they have to find a way to create policies and then enforce or implement the policies with the workforce they can get. And knowing that the workforce they can get is going to have their own biases and confusions and whatever, and maybe, you know, they're not going to always make the call Mark Zuckerberg would have made, or whoever's on the committee designing the process would make. It's a tremendously hard problem, both to come up with the rules and then come up with systems to implement them. And you should expect there to be mistakes. And it's, I think, a really high bar to say that what they're doing is censoring or hemming in a certain viewpoint, even in a kind of loose use of censor where you don't mean government censor, but you just mean delegitimate. I'm sure there are cases where I'm sure that the content policies they have make it easier to get, are making it easier than it used to be to get center-left kind of views out, and harder than it used to be to get super hard left or right-wing views out. But by the same token, it might be that their old policies made it artificially easy to get very fringy views out, because very fringy views anger or excite people, and they over prioritized anger and excitement as drivers of things and other things. So it's hard to know. I'm sure they've made mistakes at all points along the way, but they have my compassion more than my anger, although I really hope they can do better than they're doing now.
I agree. I'll also point out that they're both free, and it's so easy to learn things from either of these platforms that nobody ever thinks about, that have nothing to do with politics or controversial ideas, especially YouTube. It's one of the great learning devices and time-saving devices I think I've ever experienced in my entire life. But leaving all that aside, so 2 points, Greg, or at least one. When you earlier said you thought there should kind of be a, let me see how you put it, maximally open forum, did you have something in particular in mind? Is this something that doesn't really exist yet? Is it Facebook or, you know, YouTube or whatever, something else? I mean, what concretely are you thinking about when you think about something like that?
I mean, there ought one kind of institution that ought to exist, whether it's a certain thing at a university or a certain lecture series in a town, or a certain kind of library or a certain bookshop that exists in a given city, is someplace that prides itself on making sure that all the fringy views get to be expressed here. Whether it's Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, now that's a public park, I don't think it should be, but there ought to be institutions like that in a society. And if you look around your society and find there are none, then you should, you know, consider trying to start one. I think there are some social media companies, for example, that are priding themselves on having much more open policies. Parler is one of them, and so forth. And we'll see if they take off or do well. There are speaker series that make, or forums that make a point of having more diverse viewpoints on them. Fort Hall Forum at least used to be like this. I think it still is. I haven't been following what they do. And I think there's those kinds of forums are good, and they ought to be supported without thinking that everything ought to be like them. Mm-hmm. That is, you shouldn't, it's a perfectly sensible and in fact the right position to think that the biology department at my school shouldn't be a debating society between creationists and people who believe in evolution, but there ought to be somewhere in the country where there is such a society. or not a society that's just about that, but that will, include debates of that, level of.
And can I just make a related point to bring this back to universities again, especially if there are students out there listening? We talked earlier about how different schools have different purposes, and they're sometimes very explicit about that. They also have different policies on the issues we've been talking about on free speech. It would seem like you should be purposeful, you as a student or a prospective student, as well as faculty should be, right, about where do I want to work? Where do I want to study? Where should I want to study? What can I expect reasonably to get if this university is very hardcore doctrinaire on a certain view, be it a religious view or, there are schools that have certain political views and they're very clear about that. We want to create this kind of citizen or whatever it might be. So we as individuals also need to be thoughtful about our purposes and whether or not a given school is an ideal setting for that purpose that is my purpose to be realized in the time that I spend there. That's something else.
There are two earlier questions that it's worth, we missed parts of. So in the first question you asked, Steve, from somebody online, they asked about the University of Chicago principles. As I recall them, I thought they were good, and I was glad that a lot of universities were adopting them. I think that's a good thing. The questioner says they're the most advanced in freedom concepts that have been published. I don't know that that's true. I don't have a particular policy statement in mind that's better than it, but you'd have to go through all of them to think they're the most advanced. But I think they're pretty good and better than most policies at most universities. So I think their wider adoption is a good thing. Anonymous attendee asked about public policy issues on opinions that universities, especially public ones, hold on issues that change over time. And I think one thing we should notice is that some of the changes that have happened that are pitched as very ideological today can also be seen as retreats from an ideological position. So for example, if a university has up statues of people, that constitutes a kind of endorsement of those people as people worth celebrating. And if you put up another new statue, you're endorsing that person as a person worth celebrating. If a university takes down, as the University of Texas did, a bunch of statues of Confederate soldiers, and here I think they were taken down by the administration through a orderly process, not as at Chapel Hill where I used to work, taken down by a bunch of people who gathered together and did it by force. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a view that a public university should not be expressing that people who committed treason to the United States are to be celebrated. In general, I think it's troubling that public universities express views on who's to be celebrated at all, but that's a problem with public universities, and why, in general, I think education and the state should be separated. But if you're going to have anyone celebrated, the change to these people are not people who should be celebrated, and that the celebration of them creates a kind of unwelcome environment for many of our students here who, these people were in favor of keeping in bondage, and that's why they're being celebrated, not because it's something incidental to them. I think it's good that they're removed, but I also think it's bad if we start putting up, statues of Shea or somebody in their place, who likewise would want a lot of us, arrested and killed. So if you're going to have statuary and things, you're going to have to come up with a policy for how you're going to have them. But those kind of things are going to have to change sometimes with public views changing. And some of those changes are not taking a new position, but backing down from a position that was taken previously on a controversial issue, namely the position that General Lee is to be celebrated, for example.
Greg, do you think there's, or both of you, do you think there's a connection, this is my own question, between, I don't know, let me put it, this is a bit vague, but I'll put it out there and see if you can answer, between, let's say, the worst versions of, quote, cancel culture. I don't know, condemning a professor who used the masculine pronoun and then demanding he be fired. It's kind of, the worst aspects of it I think of as an effort to sort of enforce an orthodoxy, even if it's not by force. You think there's a connection between that and eroding erosion of respect for the right to free speech? Is there any connection to be drawn there?
I think so. I mean, I think if you don't value a context in which people disagree, if you don't value free thought, then you're not going to value the right to free speech. And you're not going to value cultural context or institutions where people can speak more freely. So I think the free speech is the kind of basic sine qua non, absolutely necessary protection of a right that arises from the fact that speaking freely is a value, which arises from the fact that thinking is a value. And if you don't respect that speaking freely is a value in any other context, that is, if you have no respect for it, which is what's going to motivate you to be the most aggressive kind of attempt to cancel everyone who disagrees with you, even a little bit on anything, then yeah, you're not going to be somebody who has the premises that are behind the right. And so you're not going to support or value the right. But we should think about what cases are actually real. I don't know if there was a case of someone who tried to get a professor fired because he used, on one occasion, used a masculine pronoun where the person preferred a feminine pronoun or something. And I can think of cases where that would be a justified firing of someone. But there are cases where people, for example, somebody was fired for showing a Jordan Peterson video where Jordan Peterson was making a kind of point about this, and that seems to me inappropriate. By the way, I draw a real distinction between, because that was the issue. Peterson became famous about the pronouns issue. But there's a distinction between different positions that aren't politically correct on that issue. I had we've all probably had students come to us and request to be referred to in a certain way, and when, by their preferred pronouns it is. And when a student does that, at least in any case I've ever experienced, it's not somebody who's power mad trying to control my speech and how I address them, and they've got, often they seem frightened, or, like this is a professor, someone who has the power to grade them, and they're making a request about how they want to be addressed. And you'd be, I think, a real jerk and really disrespectful to the student. And if you were indifferent to that and you said, no, I'm going to call you this regardless of what you think, and even though that's not how you understand yourself, I'm going to call you he or whatever, no matter what, that I think would be a disrespectful way to behave to a student. And I think it would be reasonable if it was in a university's, if a university was uncomfortable with having faculty who treat their students that way. However, I think it's a very different thing to mandate that the only view one can have of trans issues is that this medical intervention worked well and that one doesn't, and here's how I understand masculinity and femininity, and it's exactly in keeping with whatever view is current about that, even though those views are changing. That's a very different thing than if a student requests a certain mode of address, that you respect that.
Can I say a few things on that? So, yeah, I also think, and in a way, this is just a different way of saying some of what Greg was saying about you asked Steve about the relationship between lessening respect for freedom of speech, the right to free speech, and lessening respect for maybe the value of speaking freely. Yeah, I also think there's a connection, and it is well put by thinking about people don't take ideas seriously. I mean, which is, again, this is, I think, a somewhat different way of saying part of what Greg was saying of, the value of ideas is, the value of reasoning. We get values from thinking, but because people really don't appreciate that as much as they used to, that, oh yeah, the mind is this powerful thing that comes up with the good ideas, that comes up with the cures for diseases and the, the better means of transportation or whatever it might be. We don't really respect ideas. And it's so sad to see this at universities, at institutions of education and learning. But what we sometimes see in the classroom these days is political posturing elevated above intellectual engagement, such that there are some people just looking for the professor to say, quote, the wrong thing politically, or that will be, can be touted as offensive to people and so on. So it's that sort of devaluing of ideas and knowledge and the free exchange that, again, Greg was talking about earlier, that's necessary for us to come up with better ideas or to find out what's wrong with these ideas, right? The million, you got to have a vigorous discussion from the best advocates. It's very sad to see that de-elevated in people's minds and, or devalued in people's minds, and the political or the right stance, quote, right stance to have on things being elevated above that.
The cases that really occur to me as examples of that on campuses are the Reedies Against Racism thing that happened at Reed University, where there were people, in effect, disrupting a Western Civ class and making it impossible for it to happen because it was Western Civ and that was viewed as racist. That really only stopped when a bunch of African-American students apparently said, "What are you speaking for me? I came here because I want to take this class and you're depriving me of it." And they stood up against that, and that eventually was quelled. But that was one example. I mentioned the Murray episode, the woman who was fired for teaching some controversy involving Jordan Peterson, and she taped some faculty meeting where she was read the Riot Act. These are kinds of examples of, and there are others, but these are the ones that come to mind as views that are seen as on the right that are, people trying to cancel it, or Brett Weinstein at Evergreen University. Outside of universities, I'll mention another one. I think the way J.K. Rowling is treated is a bit, in this case, I don't think it's had much effect on her. She's a hugely popular and wealthy and best-selling author, and I don't think she's going to suffer much for this. But I think there's something weird and troubling about taking a view that, whether right or wrong, was something almost everybody held a few years ago, and trying to regard it as a horror that someone should hold it now, and something that should deserve public censure, rather than maybe tutting at her a little bit if you think she's wrong.
And for what it's worth, she's suffering now. There's how much she might suffer in terms of sales or movie rights or all that. But if you really care about human beings, then you care about human beings. And I would think it's not fun being called some of the things that she's been called, and having to try to worrying about what the hell is going on to my image and so on. So, I mean, there is a certain suffering right there. Anyway, I do have to get going, guys.
Yeah, we said we'd go till 5, and we're at 5. So I guess we should just end by thanking everyone for listening, and hopefully everything we said was in the pale, so people will want to deal with us more and hear more things from us, and share with us your contrary opinions as you have them. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all very much. Happy holidays.